Saviors from the sky, miners of the ether, godless profiteers, and irreverent merchants. All of these things can be used to describe the Kharadron Overlords, a race of skyfaring dwarden or dwarves who long ago left the moors of solid ground and struck out amongst the clouds for survival. And while they are the most scientifically advanced faction we've seen so far, they've been able to achieve great heights of technology, mixing magic and science as we know it, to create flying cities, cloud mining, sky fleets, and trade networks. But what other factions in Age of Sigmar don't see is the price that was paid for these achievements. These heights of greatness don't come without pain and sacrifice. And so for the Kharadron Overlords, their sacrifice was the rejection of a god. They had to destroy their old worldview, the way that they honored dwarves. And they had to form the sheer mind, will, and grit to survive alone in the Age of Chaos. These are people that lost everything and then rebuilt it all and more in the sky. And so today we are taking a look at the story of the mortal realms from the perspective of the Kharadron Overlords. My name is Doug with 2+Stuff, and in this video we're going to be breaking down this story and basically what the world events are like from their perspective. How they see the drama of gods and chaos and the forces of order unraveling before them. And before we jump into that video, I just want to give a quick shout out. I'm no longer doing ads on this channel because YouTube's monetization stuff is just getting absolutely crazy. So it is of real importance to me. If you want to support the channel, you can either become a member here on YouTube. I have some videos in the works that are going to be members only, just music and background stuff like that. Or use any of the affiliate links in my description down below, as every single time you use those, big or small, Games Workshop or not, it supports me, my wife, our cats, and the whole operation. Not Just Gaming has a whole bunch of modeling supplies, so everything you need for your next hobby project is right there. And I also want to say a shout out to the Goonhammer Network, which I am now a part of. If you want to see any cool stuff about AOS, particularly strategies regarding the Kharadron Overlords as is pertinent, head over to Goonhammer and check it out. So to begin our tale of the Kharadron Overlords, we need to head to Chamon, the realm of metal, a fantastic place of alchemy and metallurgy, mineral riches, and impossible sights. And it's here that the first tribes of dwarves, or what we would now call dwarden, were found in the mortal realms. First of all, by Sigmar, while he was collecting isolated groups of mortals together in the Age of Myth. We talked about this, started this whole series with Sigmar's perspective, and now I'm kind of putting in the little bits of timeline to kind of have some context for us. And at this point, we are really talking about the dwarves as we know them from fantasy battles, right? Because at this point, they've kind of carried over a lot of those traditions. It's a land that's, full of mineral riches, and it's a dwarven paradise. Build holds that can, build deep into these mountains. They can use volcanoes, clockwork fortifications. It's just everything we remember from the fantasy battles world, just kind of elevated a bit. And as I pointed out in that Sigmar perspective video, was that this amount of time is indeterminate, meaning we have no idea how long the Age of Myth actually was, but we do know it spanned multiple generations, like many, many, many. To the point where Sigmar initially finds a whole bunch of just like despondent groups of dwarves here and there, and then he forges them into an empire. The species begins to boom, just like humanity booms. Elves are kind of creeping, but they're kind of a slow-growing race. A boom for them is still pretty moderate by every other race's standards. And while the Age of Myth is a very long and ill-defined time, there are a few very important things we need to mention regarding the origin of the KO. After they were established a bit, these dwarves who were running around the mortal realms began calling themselves dwarden, possibly as a moniker for the changing of the setting and that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously Games Workshop has their reason for doing it, but I mean, in terms of the internal world of the lore, they just kind of perceive themselves as being different. But the thriving population of dwarden were at one point reunited with their deities, Grugni and Grimnir. And this was a big deal. It's a big deal anytime any people group are reunited with a deity, especially one that embodies kind of their aesthetics, their themes so well. And once these two were returned, Grimnir, who's really focusing on the martial aspect of the dwarden, they're going to grow up to be warriors. But then Grugni also has the emphasis on the smithing, the craftsmanship. And so as soon as these two return, instead of just having a population boom, because now they're safe and secure thanks to Sigmar, now they're having like a renaissance. It's more than just a population boom, but like they're getting better at everything. Grogny's teaching them arcane magic, mastery engineering. Grimnir's out there leading battles left and right because he's a very antsy person. And they turned this whole region from being, Chaman, the realm of metal, where it's a perfect environment for dwarves because it caters to their style, and he morphs it into it's that, but now it's also like an industrial powerhouse of the mortal realms. Sure, they lacked much in the way of food and water, but every single other civilization needed metals, jewels, raw materials, that kind of stuff, and so these became the forges of civilization that Sigmar and that early pantheon used to kind of bring the Age of Myth to its heights. And as a result of that, some more stuff started to happen. Grogny began designing and making more technology for his people. Again, he's the god of smithing and crafting and all this kinds of things. And it said that the smoke and breath of his toils drifted into the air of Chaman to create a ether gold. Is a substance that we'll talk about more shortly. But basically, there's a mythology built around it that it's Grogny's breath or something like that up in the sky. The point is, in the Age of Myth, people are beginning to look upwards and realize that there's still mineral riches to be had, but in gaseous form, not just rocks. That's the whole point of this. The actual origins of the stuff is ultimately irrelevant. But it also becomes apparent that the other species have reunited with their deities, and things are accelerating uncomfortably so, right? Like the pace of change and development and, invention, really, begins to go too fast for anyone to be super comfy, because now all the gods are returned. We now have the elven gods making new elves and reforging them. There's a lot of mystery shrouded around them. That's odd. Human populations are just out the nose, spreading everywhere. It's getting to be a lot. Because I want to point out here that, like, if we think about human technological progress before the Industrial Revolution, it's a very slow moving, chart. If you have technological progress going up and then time on the bottom scale, you'll see like a very, very moderate kind of like angle. It's going upward. Sometimes it goes down. We lose a little bit of technology. And then when we hit the Industrial Revolution, it's, for all intents and purposes, it's a vertical line. We're growing so much relative to how long it took us to learn things before. They are basically doing the same thing, but when it comes to not just population, but technology, magic usage, all these things are putting massive stresses on the realms. And while we don't have a ton of information about what these fullest, what that exponential part of the chart looks like, what they were able to create, we know a few things. We know that they built these insane clockwork fortresses. Archaon mentions one specifically in the Realmgate Wars as this like impenetrable set of gears that's always in motion, and it's like this unassailable fortress. We've seen steam machines, both for mining and, it's rough vehicles for transporting things here and there, and even some crude flying machines. Now, flying machines are not, they're not truly new, right? They've had crude dirigibles and gyrocopters, that kind of stuff, but those can only be kept aloft for a short amount of time before needing refueling. Energy was always the problem. And that was until research began into ether gold. So we're going to circle back to that material that was in the sky. Think of it as a cloud that is so dense that it feels like a solid. Like if you were to put your hand in it, you would feel the difference between your hand moving through empty air and the ether gold, but it's not a solid. It just stands there suspended. It has an insane amount of buoyancy, which is important because it means if you put enough of it into something like a dirigible, it can be held as a balloon. But also, you could burn it and it becomes a highly efficient fuel, which is the use that really started to gain traction. I'm sure at some point people had some inside of like balloons and stuff like that, but it's when they really started to think of it in the context of fuel and energy exchange that things really got crazy. Now, I am a history nerd if you have not figured that out by now, so I'm going to put this into a historical context for you. In 1861, the Monitor was the first thoroughly modern submarine. Okay, steam-powered, ironclad warship used in the U.S. Civil War. Its battle with the Merrimack is the stuff of legends over here for Civil War nerds in the U.S. But imagine if you are the designer of the monitor, right? And it just rolled off the line and you feel so proud, okay? Like, wow, this is it, guys. Next step in human evolution in terms of our ability to create machines, whatever that machine might be, war or otherwise. This is an achievement. And then you look at your neighbor, right, the next nation over, and they launch the first nuclear-powered submarine with almost 100 years of technological progress on what you just made, named the Nautilus because it's so science fiction-y that they took the name from 40,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That is the kind of gap that exists between steam machines of the Duarden and what we're now tapping into with the ability to use ether gold as energy. That's kind of how I'm dividing this. Yes, both technologies do the same thing. They're both subs and flying machines, but they're vastly different in their designs and, most importantly, their limitations. These top Duarden engineers were working tirelessly on it, basically strapping crude ether engines, as they'd know, to boats. Like specifically just boats that you would use on water because they didn't know what else to do. Or they would modify like existing things like gyrocopters or dirigibles with these engines. And I kind of think of it as like the Model T era of the car, right? They're out there, people see them, and they're kind of becoming prevalent, but they're not like ubiquitous. They're not everywhere. These are only the central hubs of technology that are going to have any kind of way to demonstrate these engines. But all the best minds are already looking at this as like, this is the technological revolution. Like, I mean, travel has been the biggest burden on this civilization that has tackled every single problem up till now. Age of Myth is when everything is going thumbs up for the good guys. So like, the future is so bright. However, they would never reach that future. At least the Duarden would never reach that future because while the dwarves and Duarden prospered in Chaman with these crazy technological wonders, an ancient sickness had begun to seep into every mortal realm right under their noses. Now, I have a dedicated video about the realm of metal, Chaman. There's a great story, kind of like a prehistory that happened in the Age of Myth. I'm going to give the briefest of sum-ups, but essentially a giant god beast, a metal dragon, or I believe it was more like a griffin type thing, landed in the dead center of Chaman. Okay, and it had so much mass and so much weight and magical power to it that it basically started to bend the island chain that was kind of near it. So it kind of became like its own little center of a solar system. Everything was in these nice straight lines. The griffin lands, and all of a sudden everything starts to bow and contort and twist around it. There's a big ritual that was encouraged by some of the Duarden to get rid of the beast, and instead it tore open a hole for Tzeentch to enter the realm of metal. Essentially, this was all a big Tzeentchian plot to get these Duarden to enact a ritual that would ultimately let Tzeentch in. I'm sure there were many humans involved. I know dwarves are not a magical race by any stretch, but I'm saying that like things were set in motion to bring that into fruition. It was a big deceit to get this door open. When it does, demons come pouring through like water and just flooding over the industrial powerhouses of the mortal realms at the time. Everybody's running in absolute panic. There is a huge detonation zone, like where that griffin landed and then where the rent in reality came through, that whole area is just gone. And I try to think about like what it would be if you were some of the dwarves like in other holds looking at what's going on. Right, you know, you're having some geographic problems, right? Your ground is shaking and all these kinds of things. And then you see a huge explosion from one of the big cities. I mean, just abject, horribly massive explosion. What do you think is happening? Because honestly, for the most part, they probably thought it was an accident at first. Some of these new technologies got crazy. Maybe someone put too much ether gold in an engine and it detonated, and here we are. But it's as the vanguard of flamers and screamers start coming from that destructive aftermath of this big explosion that people are realizing, no, this is something totally different. It's something that they have no context for. Remember, generations upon generations had no idea what chaos was, and now the largest demon army of Tzeentch is rolling directly through your downtown. Some tried to fight and died. Most ran, and they were run down, meaning they died in the pursuit. Some further holds thought that they could have a chance. Maybe if we just, go into our holds, lock our doors real tight, we can just kind of weather the storm. But one by one, they started to fall, just like, candles in a mine being snuffed out. Tzeentch warbands assembled and began targeting the holds that gave the most resistance. And when I say they targeted the holds, they did everything. Like, they had mortal warbands, demons coming in. Remember, even though Tzeentch was the big architect behind Shaman, it's the realm he had his eye on, every Chaos God was in every realm. So you've also got Slanesh running around, units running around, Khorne stuff, there's Nurgle warbands, like all of these things are descending. And it's this act of mass murder and destruction that happens in Shaman. It really breaks the Duwarden culture as a unified culture in a way that it'll never come back from. Basically, their responses to this action of Tzeentch coming in and everything getting messed up is how we determine the different kinds of Duwarden. Some reacted by hiding in lava flows and becoming more mercenary to maybe bend morals but survive, fire slayers. Some ran to flee with the races of men back to Azir. They became parts of the cities of Sigmar. You know what I mean? So everyone's responses to this are how we get these various factions. And so this is really where the dots are connected between the carnage happening in Shaman and the technological wonder of the Age of Myth engineers. Because some of those Duwarden, as they're all running, again, another possible reaction to the carnage, is they hop inside of these crude flying machines and they just try to see how can we get as far away as possible. Now that's actually not a bad plan, but it's important to remember that Shaman is hard to navigate, so being able to go up and over obstacles is a huge boon. And I'm sure that some of these people who know how to run the flying machines would also know where others are. Meaning, if you are, sharing research on ether engines with another Duwarden clan 200 miles away, you at least have somewhere to go. At least I know if this machine is going to last to anywhere, I need it to last towards the next airport, basically. And as these ships are flying out, they're getting assaulted by screamers and flamers of Tzeentch, and they really immediately began to learn it's best if we huddle up. Because if they're apart, they get picked apart, right? If they're lone ships fall very easily, but if you act as a flotilla or something, everything survives much better. Now, of course, we in our modern world understand that, flotillas and envoys and that kind of stuff, convoys rather, going from one place to another in naval stuff, that's pretty ubiquitous for us, but for them, they had to learn that on the fly. Pardon the pun. And this becomes a really defining lesson, because when that shattering event happens of all the different races of dwarves going in different directions and taking on different identities, the lessons that teach them how to survive really are what give them their character. What was the lesson that we have here? Well, when we work together, we survive. That's it. It's one that permeates every aspect of their life. We're going to keep coming back to this, but it's a major theme of this army. You know what won't help us survive? The gods. Our own god personally abandoned us. Grugni was nowhere to be seen. And this was not an instantaneous, singular event. There was a whole gap of time where prayers and requests were being sent out to Grugni as things were getting worse. The Lode Griffin thing that messed up Shaman was there for a while, and he was just not helping. And this is after a time where they had spent generations with him. Grugni was a very involved part of his people until he just disappeared. So, what is it like if you know God exists, you've hung out, and he is actively ignoring you leaving on red? Right? And I'm not talking about some abstract, you get the little, Christian plaques that are like, when I looked, I only saw one set of footprints. Where were you? Nothing like that, okay? It's more like, I went out to Wendy's last week with Grugni, and why isn't he answering his phone, right? It's not some ethereal thing. He's a dude who's not here, and he should be here. And this is the foundation of the faction-wide resentment towards Grugni. And this carries from the Age of Myth, right here as the Age of Chaos is dawning, all the way to the most recent thing that involved the Kharadron Overlords in the Broken Realm series. There's a moment where Grugni shows up to help his people, but he has to disguise himself as a Kharadron Overlord because they do not like him. He basically scares Be'lakor away, but that's all he does. But the idea was he couldn't show up as Grugny, he had to look like something else. And the idea is simple. Where was Grugny when we were at our worst? Right? Sigmar found the early dwarves and freed you two, Grimnir and Grugny, from something that they are still very vague upon. We don't know how our gods got captured, but that's your secret, whatever. And then you were here when things were awesome, and we were, rolling in money, building all kinds of technology and toys. Grimnir's out there having a great time with war. But when things got rough, you just left us. And so the general collective Kharadron Overlord attitude towards their own deity and the Pantheon as a whole is just like, sawed off. I'm doing a ton of paraphrasing and possibly projecting, but that's just the basic vibe they give off whenever it comes to religious matters or anything with the divine. It's just, I want you to note that undercurrent because it goes through everything. Okay, so sorry about that little detour. Let's get back to our crude flotilla. At first I mentioned they were living like raiders, right? The flotillas would roll up to a place, one or two ships would detach. They would either go down to the ground for supplies or fishing around the clouds to find more ether gold to keep these engines going. And this becomes a very crucial time period for these Duarden, because right now they are essentially a rabble of sky refugees. But the next step in their societal evolution is what forges them into the Kharadron Overlords. By the way, I'm on page 5 of my notes and we just founded the faction, so I thought that would share that. And when I was trying to tackle the revolutions that happened in this time period, I broke it down into 3, just to kind of keep my brain organized. There was an industrial revolution, a revolution in societal hierarchies and values, and a governmental revolution. And if you don't have all 3 of these, you don't have the Kharadron Overlords. If it misses any one of them, this faction is completely different. And so let's go through them one by one. I talked about an industrial revolution. One of the defining features of the faction, known as Kharadron Overlords as we know them now, is that they live in these colossal cities in the sky, known as skyports. But these skyports they had some very humble beginnings, we'll say, because really the first skyport was just the first time one ship threw a line and tied itself to another one. The early time of the Kharadron Overlords was all about just finding these disparate ships who made it out of the Age of Chaos, or at least the epicenter of destruction, and kind of pooling them all together. What resources do we actually have at our disposal? How good are these ships working? How can we keep them afloat? Like that kind of organizational structure started. And to do that, you need materials, you need tools. Not just gas, but like literal tools to fix the engines. Okay, well, if we want to bind these boats together and make a floating platform for ourselves, that requires raw materials to be processed and industry to process them. Now we need people to take boats away from your city to go collect those things. So you got to build more boats. And so it feels like they're playing an early game of like Settlers of Catan, where they're just like, I have boats, but I need wood and sheep. And there must have been a point in this civilization where industry was set up enough that the Sky City could begin to grow. And that's really what I see as kind of the technological starting point for these guys when they stopped just having to repair and use what they scavenged during the Age of Chaos and began creating things. They were able to build the technological stuff required for new ether engines, which now means that there's an entirely new branch of technological growth that wouldn't have happened otherwise, because now they're experimenting in real time. And it's to the death. Well, the more engines you build, the more weight that you can carry, which means your city can grow. And you can use that space to get more industry, a foundry where now you're melting and making your own steel beams for things. Shipyards, ether engine factories, places to refine materials. Now you can have places for schools where we can begin teaching each other how to sail the winds. What I'm saying is, I mentioned before that there was like that scale of technological progress for humans where it's a very slow raise and then it's like a vertical line when we hit the Industrial Revolution. There was a point where they got enough ships and resources and people together to start building actively in the sky. And I feel like that is the same point in their timeline. As I think about the comparison between human history and what's being described in this book, I know, it's just for fun. But I think about this though, in the 1500s, right, that's Leonardo da Vinci time, the Renaissance. progress is slow and painful and glacially paced. But what if, in that exact same time period, everyone already knew how to do everything that we know today? They simply didn't have the industry to do it. So, for example, you take a bunch of the best people and smartest thinkers today, you drop them back there. How much more quickly do those revolutions happen in human history? Because that's essentially what we have here. We have all these architects and engineers in Duarden who are all smart. They built these ships. They kept them going. And so the second that the resources become physically available, now they can use that potential, all that knowledge they have. It's already ready to go, hitting the ground running, which is kind of a cool difference to think about history. What if you could just drop someone back there who knew those things? Now I want to move on from the industrial side and talk about a new form of government. And this is where we introduce ourselves to the next major evolution of these Duarden. Because at first, everything is just about survival. Everyone has everything in common because I care about my neighbor more than I care about Tzeentch demons. That math is really easy. I'll do anything I can for them. But the minute there's stability and resources become scarce, well, that's when, rifts and arguments start to form. Each captain is a captain of their own ship. So what does authority structure look like when you try to get together as a flotilla to survive? Remember, when we work together, we live. Do you set it up that whoever, boat you're on, that captain is in charge? Because that mimics the old, hold rules. If you were the hold father or whatever, you had absolute authority over your domain. But these ships are very tiny. So it's no, that doesn't quite work. And so the whole ability of these guys to work together while they're trying to do these industrial revolutions, it just became clear, this isn't working. Enter the code. Part legal document, part cultural record, part history, moral compass. It's about everything. These early Sky Duarden sat down and created a society from scratch. Now, I'm going to list a bunch of stuff that comes off the top of my head, but essentially these are the kinds of questions that needed to be asked and answered and agreed upon so that society could function. So the examples I came up with, we need ether gold. Who's getting it? Okay, right now we're creating a division of labor. How are they provided for in return? Which means now you need a currency to make that happen. Now we need to map the skies and choose destinations. There's so much we don't know about all this. How are we going to, discover new knowledge and store and record it? Because these original builders and ship designers need to retain every iota of information that they have. They need to develop schools and teachers and housings and work details and maintenance crews. Because if that knowledge is lost, that is more priceless than any one of these ships at this point. Going back to our skyboats, that's kind of the aesthetic thing around Kharadron Overlords. What happens if two ships lay claim to the same ether gold vein? It's bigger than expected and you didn't realize the two were connected. How are the crews paid? How are the percentages and the bonuses? What if a captain dies? Who builds ships? Where? Do they have a say in who captains them? All these kinds of questions. The code addresses all of these things to a painful, minute detail. And these early captains form a council that would evolve over time. Now, this is, of course, as they're coming up with problems, they're finding solutions and trying to work together. But I want to back out here for just a second from the process of making the code. Because it's more than just a legal and social structure document. Right, the way you resolve disputes and accusations, that's most of the stuff I talked about before. But it also talks about your interaction with outsiders, how we provide for lesser fortunate or different classes within our society, what we value, what we don't tolerate. All of these things go into creating and defining the character of a people, the cultural sticks and carrots, if you will. And as skyports grow, they build satellites. They grow their own skyports. Remember, the Age of Chaos was about 500 years, and we're far beyond rafts being tied together as this society develops. The code kept every member of society active, useful, taken care of, and these dwarves were all given a singular purpose for their lives. And just as their ancestors flourished in the Rock of Chaman, these Kharadron Overlords applied that same industrious life to the skies. And how they flourished is represented by the evolution of the code, because values change over time and places. People become more distinct in isolation, and so when you and I play as the Kharadron Overlords, this is what the various skyports are trying to represent. These distinctions in how their particular codes have evolved to represent their values in their society. As these other groups reinterpret or misinterpret the code, they adjudicate crime differently and so on, and all those things go into building a distinct people group. And this is simply the rough game-y approximation of it. But as a whole, they chose to write all of this out simply so that they could work together. Remember, together we survive. They cannot rely on anyone else, and if they band together, they can make it work. However, there are consequences to this decision, because the very survival tools that these Duardans are using are also changing them dramatically. And that kind of moves us into our third and final part, and that is a revolution of societal hierarchies and values. Because the system of the code doesn't work if everyone is out for themselves, thinking that they are too important to do whatever labor needs to be done. We need to incentivize people to find work and contribute in a meaningful way. How do you do that when everything's changed so radically for these dwarves? So thinking about the origins of them, their worldview, pre all of this, we really get the sense from the fantasy battles section. I feel like they were just very much classical Tolkien dwarves, like from J.R.R. Tolkien's work. Mining, family lineages, holds, territory, greed. These are all kind of qualities or themes that are pretty generic for dwarves as a whole. But those tendencies look very different in this new environment. Some are obvious. We're not using underground holds anymore. We're all in ships. But some are more subtle. Like, say, what do you do if your family lineage is the thing that gives you credit or value, but your whole family's dead and so is your hold? They're a society that reveres history deeply. They record it. They have the big book of grudges and all these kinds of things. What if that history is just wiped away? Right? Machismo and your lineage and your bloodline, all those things were used as social capital in the old world, or the age of myth, I should say, but none of that matters now. No one cares if you are Gimli, son of Gloim. This is, if you'll pardon the pun, all hands on deck. Everybody works. No one is too good for any job. And so the way that the dwarves, now the Kharadron Overlords culture shifted to meet these realities, right? What are the, again, cultural carrots and sticks, the things we value? How do we put that into this nice direction? Well, they decided to do it through two things: mercantilism and self-determination. What this really means, though, is that it is a achievement-based society. When the MVP is the captain who returns with the most ether gold, a new kind of race commences. Who can be the best captain? What kind of skills are needed to be the best kind of captain? Once you have the best captain, how do you get them to invest in the best ships and crew? How do you navigate the skies? So simply by saying, hey guys, we need one thing, ether gold, an entire industrial race kicks off of people's values saying, well, I want to be the one who provides the most for my people. That's an honorable thing. And from that, essentially hundreds of quote-unquote small businesses began to form. Loose bartering became contractual work. A monetary value started being assigned to these Duarden who had skills that were needed. And really what it is how much ether gold can you contribute to this society? And this is, for the dwarves, an entirely new measurement of character. Yes, they were all about gold. They liked mining and kind of hoarding wealth and all that stuff. But it's different when it's, first of all, to the death, and it's specifically to provide for everybody. It's not about hoarding the thing. It's about giving it back so that we all live. How well do you provide for the greater whole and balance the skills, technology, and manpower needed to do so? And to give you a sense of kind of the equivalence of these things, when you read the Fireslayer battle tome, we are regaled with these epic crusades in the halls of their, honored heroes, like these great battles that happen. They're recording all of their grandiose achievements. Whereas when it comes to the Kharadron Overlords, we are regaled with the incomprehensible sums of ether gold. They are the same thing to their respective people. The martial prowess, the achievements on the battlefield for the Fire Slayers are mimicked, or I guess kind of represented by, the accumulation of ether gold for the Kharadron Overlords. It's just how they brag. It's their capital. It's what they have to offer. Now, getting on a practical level, this is a point of view video after all. Let's say that you are a dwarven that's just come of age in the Kharadron Overlords. What does that kind of society look like? Well, right off the bat are a series of trials to see if you're a good fit for the skies. And this is where you perform your duties as a deckhand, and you're basically judged by a council and a bunch of captains. If you fail this trial, you can take up work as one of the many skyport-based positions: forges, textiles, public services, whatever. But if you succeed and you are chosen, you will be assigned to an Archanaut company to serve as a deckhand. And you're going to spend a lot of time in this particular position because they rotate around the ship. You're going to go to all the different sections of it. You're going to learn all the different, mechanisms of a modern ship and really see what appeals to you. So maybe you're a gunner one week, next week you're running the engines, then you're cleaning the deckhand. Now you kind of work with navigation, all those kinds of things. Whatever kind of particular aptitude you have, that's what you're going to hone in on. Perhaps even going to a specialized school to sharpen your skills. And this is how Archanaut Company can evolve into different roles. They can, upgrade, they can go to colleges, become navigators, that kind of stuff. But essentially, everyone needs to make sure that you're not going to be a liability on the ship before you can become a member of an important part of the crew, rather. Now, if you show a bit of aptitude in everything, or you just seem to have a leadership aura about you, you could be chosen to go to a military academy, which is another set of educations and trials that's really meant to sift through the Kharadron Overlords and find the ones who were born to be captains. Or, again, as I said, if you showed adept skill at navigation, now it's time that they drop you off at port so you can go to the Navigators Guild and refine that craft. Basically, the whole society works as a flowchart meant to drop you in the right position for your skill sets and aptitudes. Would you be useful in the sky? Yes or no? What are you good at? No, are you good at this? Yes or no? Are you good at that? Yes or no? And then basically once you find what someone is good at, how can we push this to 11? Right? Investing in everyone makes us stronger as a whole. Remember the lesson we're talking about: when we work together, we survive. So yeah, someone might not rise above, they have to have janitors somewhere, I'm sure. But if you invest in him and make sure he's the best, that dwarf will love his life and work to the end with absolute precision and perfection and make the place clean, safe, and wonderful for everybody. If you invest in them, they'll do it. And when you put all of these things that we've talked about for the last, I'm looking at my clock here, 40 minutes or so, when you put it all together, you get a very interesting and a very intense kind of people. They are radically independent to the point where they rail against dependency on anything. They place an immense amount of weight on personal accomplishments. There's no honor or title or whatever that you can use to impress them. I need to see you do something amazing. They're also shrewd businessmen and women, down to the most minute detail. In fact, so minute details that people often feel like they're dealing with the devil when they enter into a contract, because it's always the fine print that gets you. By what I mean, it's like, the captain says, okay, we got you here. And the person's like, well, when do we land? It's like, oh, we don't land unless you pay us a landing fee. You only paid to get here. Like that contract keeps evolving over time and you just kind of keep tricking people. And this goes on for some time. And they do a tremendous amount of work. Again, it took all three of those things to come together to make this a faction, and for hundreds of years they were allowed to prosper. In fact, the Kharadron Overlords are one of the very few armies that not only survived the Age of Chaos, but technically thrived during it, which is kind of backwards for the good guys, as you would think, but they did great. And then at some point in their history, they looked down and they saw something new. Light had opened up in the fields of Akshi, and they went to investigate, and there it was, Sigmar's entry into the mortal realms. In fact, one of the first actions within the mortal realm story is Sigmar sending a whole bunch of Stormcast Eternals into Chaman to look for the dwarves. So, like, they're probably looking at these dudes like, something's going on down there. And they are seeing that these new guys, the Stormcast, are picking fights with all the Chaos factions. And all of the leaders of the Kharadron Overlords are looking at this and like, well, this is a new war. And with new war comes new opportunity. And they're kind of doing the math, and they're like, well, we can deal with these guys, the Stormcast. Like, they're willing to talk to us, have a conversation. The other guys just want to eat us or do whatever crazy chaos ritual. But, you know, Stormcast, they at least seem civil. And it seems like they're looking to colonize, which means what? Trade and money. Not just the transportation of goods and services, but things like maps. You know how useful a Kharadron Overlord map would be if they can go up and just scout the entire area? And so after seeing that, you know, Sigmar was able to create bastions of order that were stable enough for them to conduct business, the Kharadron Overlords descended and became part of the Pantheon of Order. Now, this is kind of a tenuous moment, right? Because a whole civilization that actively rejects the gods with a particular disdain for their own, are talking to Stormcast Eternals who are literally part of the Storm God and his personal emissaries. But the needs here are too great to be ignored. The forces of order need stuff, and the Kharadron Overlords are willing to and able to provide it for a price. And when I say help, what do I mean? What do the Kharadron Overlords provide the forces of order? Trade, transportation, scouting, technology, like they're sharing their technology, which is not necessarily the same as trade. Surveying, and more. All the things that the Kharadron Overlord learned to do, but just for hire. And as we've discussed the various realms when I did a series on them, they're all so different. They all have things that they provide and things that they desperately need. So for example, Gur is known to provide tons of the food, the raw meat that makes the cities of Sigmar possible. That has to be traded. Well, you load a bunch of meat onto a ship, you go to Chaman, trade the meat for a whole bunch of metal, and then you bring the metal to Gur, where it's not plentiful. At the same time as getting a whole bunch of new business ventures, they were also reintroduced to some long-lost cousins. The Duarden who fled to Azir, becoming part of the cities of Sigmar, and those who hid deep under natural fortifications of volcanoes, the Fire Slayers. And while there's a form of mutual respect, there's not much else. All these different groups did exactly what they needed to in order to survive, and it pulled them in very different directions. What we can say is that the KO are not jazzed about any of the religious zealots. Okay, so like the Fire Slayers trying to put Grimnir back together, they're looking at that and they're like, nah. You know, more of a good riddance type thing. Okay, one less Dwarden god to mess with our destiny. But there's not outright confrontation over it. And realistically, that brings them up to their most current point in the history. They've shown up consistently throughout the Rumgate Wars. They were there. They had a great scene at the end of like all the different ships firing and like this great whirlwind mass descending from the sky and pulverizing the ground, shooting up demons. There's a bunch of great imagery and story arcs with these guys, but those are the main points. Their origins define an inordinate amount of their character. If you want the specific stories, you can of course read the timeline. I go through a bunch of them here on the channel. They were knocked around a whole bunch in the Necroquake, and then they jumped into the Era of the Beast by fighting for Vindicarum. Like I said, Grugni made a low-key appearance, and it seems he kind of wants to reconnect, but that's a story that's for another day, I suppose. And so let's end this video like I end all of them by simply asking the question, why are these guys cool? What is it about the Kharadron Overlords that we've been talking about this entire time? And there's a few things, right? The first one is just adapt or die. I love those stories of just things had to go in a different direction because we were headed on a course for self-destruction. And that's what so many of the Dwarven holds did. They were like, oh, we can survive. We'll batten down the hatches. And you couldn't. That lesson we talked about of when we work together, we survive that permeating through a society to where they invest the most that they can into every member of it to make them all stronger is a really cool worldview, because it sounds exceptionally compassionate, which flies in the face of everything you know about dwarves, who are very gruff and uncaring, but it's more utilitarian than it is, I should say, kind. Regardless, though, it makes for a very efficient society. I love that they are essentially apostates in a setting full of deities, right? Like Sigmar and Nagash pour their essence into their soldiers. The Sylvaneth are built by Alariel, and the Kharadron Overlords are like, and we're also here, guys. That's it. And we are also here. And lastly here, I wanted to throw up, in addition to all the things we talked about today, there's something to be said for a faction that narratively has a reason to be everywhere. There's just something really nice when you never have to try too hard to come up with a story as to why your factions are fighting, and the KO are everywhere. They're transporting everything, fighting all the time, being hired for just about any job you can imagine. I love that stuff. It makes narrative games so much more simple. But friends, this video is almost at an hour long on my end. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Kharadron Overlords. Tell me some of your favorite stories about them. Did I miss anything? Other events that you think are point of view defining for them? I would love to know in the comments down below, and I look forward to chatting with you guys there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I can't wait to hang out with you again. Happy wargaming.